Welcome back. Next in our never-ending series of JavaScript-ish components in Bootstrap is one of my favorites, which is called collapse. So collapse is not exactly its own component. There's no visual component that you'll see, like a button or a drop-down or something. Rather, it's more of a JavaScript plugin. You add a couple of pieces to existing components to show and hide content. So collapse lets you make things like this. You can click a button and have something reveal. Or you could make something like this, an accordion, where we're clicking a link and it's showing us content that corresponds to that link. So it's a way to connect a button or a link to another piece of content that you want to show or hide. So let's see how it works. What you need to do is make a button or a link. There's two different ways of doing this, and I'll show both. And either way, you need to set a data toggle equal to collapse on that button or the link. Then there's two different ways to tell it what to collapse, what to show and hide when you click on this item. So for a link, we can start with that. You give it an href that corresponds to an ID or a class on the thing you're trying to collapse. So I think it will be easier if I just do a demo. So let's make a link here. I have a new file, totally empty. And in this file, well, that's a lie. It's not completely empty. Almost totally empty. Let's put an anchor tag with the class btn success, and we'll come back to href for a moment, and I'll just say, click me. Okay. So when we click this button, let's have another bit of text. Let's just have a div for now. And this div is just going to have some text in here. And when we click this button, I want this text to show or hide. And we can style it later, make it look like a card, which is what they have here. But the most basic thing we need to do is tell our anchor tag data toggle, this is hopefully familiar, equals collapse. So this makes it a collapse enabled anchor tag. Now we need to tell it what to collapse. So first, we need to give our div a class equal to collapse. So whatever's in this div, not this div right here, you can't highlight it, there we go. This will show or hide. But first, I need to give it an ID. And I'll just call this ID, I don't know, content. And then over here, in the href of our anchor tag, I'm going to specify the destination, essentially, of this button is hashtag or octothorpe content, the ID content, which is right here. And there should only be one thing that has that ID. So these need to match. And that should actually do it for me. It's not very pretty, but it's showing and hiding. And you can see we get this animation. So if we wanted to, we could prettify it a little bit. Just instead of lorem ipsum right there, I would put a card in here and then do a card body. We could even do a card title too, like that, except not a div. Let's do an h4 and just say collapse me. And then in the card body, we'll put our lorem ipsum. Okay. And if we look at this, oh, and I'm missing, so the card title goes inside the card body. There we go. That looks fine enough. You can see they wrap it in a paragraph. So we can do that too. Put our anchor tag in a paragraph. And I'll also show you how to do the same thing with a button. So we have an anchor tag here where we're using the href attribute to collapse that. Now let's do the same thing with a button. So with a button, btn, let's do btn info, and we'll say click me. And then we're going to say data toggle equals collapse. And then this part's a little different. There is no href on a button. So instead, what we say is data target equals, and we can actually have it target the same thing, ID of content. Okay, so we can do that, content, and that's it. So now they both work to toggle it on and off. And we could have a separate one instead. So if I wanted, I can duplicate this div and give it a different ID. So instead of content, I hate doing this, but content2 if we wanted to, and then set data target to be content2. And what's going on? There we go. This one, well, we can't actually tell the difference. So let's say collapse me to. So this one is coming from this button, and this one is coming from that button. All right, so that's one thing you can do with collapse. You can also do what's called multiple targets. So we have two different elements here. This one toggles this first element, this one toggles the second one, and then we have this one that toggles both. I personally have never really used this feature in the real world, but what you do is give both things that you want to collapse from this button, and instead of an ID, you also give them a class. So like multi-collapse or this isn't a Bootstrap specific class name. Then you can target based off of anything that has that ID and make it collapse with this button. So I can show you that here. I'll fast forward through some stuff. Okay, so what I've done is I've made 3 different cards. They just have a different title up here. And there's nothing to do with collapse just yet. So I'm gonna start by adding in, let's do a paragraph, and I'll put 3 different buttons in here or anchor tags. I kind of like the anchor tag approach. So let's do that. A.btn, and then let's make this first one danger. And I'll leave href blank on these 3. I'm going to duplicate it 3 times. I'll do danger, warning, and then dark. Why not? So we have 3 buttons, and the first one I'll say is thing 1, thing 2, and this last one is going to be all things. So when I click this, I want this to toggle. Thing 2 should toggle this one, and this one is actually going to toggle all 3. So the first thing we have to do for all 3 of these buttons is give them data toggle equals collapse. Okay. Then what we need to do is wrap each of these cards in a collapse div. Collapse, like that. And then put the card content inside there. So we can just start with this first one and get it to work. And we need to give it an ID. So this div, I'll give it ID of thing 1. And then up here, I'll say this button that corresponds to thing 1, I will have it make thing 1 collapse. So we use that ID, and you can see it's now hiding, and I can make it show by clicking on it. Okay. And for the record, if I want it to show by default, I can do this. Just give it the class show, and it shows up to start. Okay, so now we do the same thing. So I'll start the other way. So thing 2, this is going to target something with the ID of thing 2 that doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to create it. I'll do my dot collapse div, put my card in there, and give it an ID of thing 2. So it's working now, and if I want, I can make that one show by default as well. Now this button is a bit different because I want it to target all 3 of these. So I'm going to give each one of them in a class, the same class. Technically, I could use the collapse class, but I'm going to just give them a class of multi. Let's just do multi like that. So it doesn't mean anything. And I also need to come down here and make my collapse div, paste that in there, put multi. So now we have 3 things with the class. I also make this one show of multi. And then in this href of this anchor tag, instead of doing the hash sign, which is for an ID, I'm going to say dot multi, which means anything with the class of multi. So now, hopefully, there we go. It collapses all 3 of them. This is collapses thing 1, thing 2, and all 3. All right, the last thing I want to show you is how to make an accordion. So accordions look like this. Where are you? Here we go. And really all that this accordion is a couple of cards where we have a card header. This is a card header here, or this one, and then some text in the body. And then we make these links. And so when you click on one of these, it is collapsing the content. There's one difference though, which is that we can only have one item open at a given time. So I'll show you how to do that. But let's just start by constructing our basic structure. So I'm going to come down after and do an H1 that just says accordion. And then in here, we can start by making a div. And they give their div a class of accordion. That doesn't actually do anything as far as making the accordion work. So you do not have to have that. But we do need a parent div to put everything in, and I'll show you why in a moment. So I'm going to give this div an ID and just call it accordion. Wait, is it A or O? Oh dear, it is an O. Okay, accordion parent, or container maybe. How about container? Okay, then inside of here, we just make a card. And in our card, we put a card header, right? And we'll put a button. Instead of doing an anchor tag, which we did up here, I'll do this one as a button. So BTN, and we want, they like doing BTN link because it looks like a link. You could make this a regular old button too. Okay, and I'll just say, sure, part 1, like that. And if we look at what we have, all right, so there's that. And they make theirs an H5 to make it larger. That's okay, we can leave ours as just a plain button inside of our card header. Now what we do is add the card body. So this card body needs to be the collapsible part. So we use the class collapse again, and then do our card body. And inside of that, we can put some lorem ipsum text. All right, so this is what we have so far. Nothing is collapsing. Oh, it's also not showing, so I could show it by default if I wanted to. Now, to make it show and hide, we need to do just our standard, here's our button. We're gonna give it data toggle equals collapse. Now, since we're using a button instead of an anchor tag, we can't set href, so we set data target. And we don't have an ID yet, so we'll just call it part 1. And then over here on our collapse div, we need to give it an ID of part 1. And now, hopefully, yes, our collapse is working. Okay, so that's the first part. Now we can just duplicate this card a couple of times. Where do you end? Right here. Let's do 3 of them. And we'll change data target to be part 2. And then on our part 2 div, we'll update that. And I'm going to actually make them only the first one show by default, so get rid of that. Then I'm going to update my text here to say part 2 and save. Then I'll do the same thing down here. This one will be part 3 as an ID, which we find on this collapse div. And then I'll change the link to say part 3. And it looks good. Is it working? Yes. It just refreshed halfway through. The thing is that I can have all 3 of them open, which in a traditional accordion you can't. So what we can do is give this special attribute called data-parent and set it to this ID that we set on the parent. Basically, this tells them the parent that they're inside of, and only one of them can be open at a given time. So data-parent, and we set that on the collapse divs. So I'm going to do it all at the same time. So our ID was accordion container. So on each one of these collapse divs, right here, and then we have right here, and then right here. I'm going to say data-parent equals ID collapse, or no, accordion. Is that what I called it? Accordion parents? Accordion container. And if I did that correctly, only one of them will stay open at a given time now. Okay, so that's how you make an accordion using collapse. Again, there is no special styling. These are just cards. It's just that we can put the links in the header of the card and it looks nice. You can make them larger if you want, wrap them in an H5, or I think that's what they do, to make it look like this. All right, so that's collapse, a useful little plugin to make things hide and show based off of buttons or links.